Most Sundays, I wear these shoes. I don't know how well you can see them, but they're old, they're creased. They don't keep a shine very well. They're hand-me-downs from my grandfather, Gunnery Sergeant Henry Michael McMahon, a Marine Corps veteran. Grandpa Henry ran away from his home in Cambridge, Massachusetts at age 16 to enlist, which I believe means he had to lie about his age. He served in the Pacific during World War II, eventually doing aerial reconnaissance, and stayed with the Corps through the Korean War, where he became the combat correspondent attached to HMR 161, the first ever helicopter transport squadron. Grandma Henry spoke proudly of his work, wistfully even. And it was a rarity to see my grandfather without one or more cameras hanging around his neck. He was constantly memorializing life. Now, Grandpa Henry was a complex man. He had a passion for the arts, which seemed at odds with his admittedly coarse demeanor. Swear like a sailor doesn't even begin to cover it, folks. And yet, I owe so much of my cultural exposure to him. We would often go into Boston to visit the Museum of Fine Arts or the Isabella Stewart Gardner. 3 times during my childhood, he, my grandmother, and I made the 9-hour drive to D.C. to see the Smithsonian. I was entranced by the airplanes, the gemstones, the sculpture. But we didn't just visit the museums. My grandfather made sure we visited the memorials. Our trips to the Marine Corps War Memorial and the Korean War Veterans Memorial always came with stories, often ones I hadn't heard before. They came with tears, too. In fact, he cried at all the war memorials, not just for those wars he served in. As in the story Laura Beth just read, we search for the names of his fallen friends at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. My grandfather did not shy away from the things that moved him. He sought beauty in his post-military life, and though it may be putting words in the mouths of the dead, I will risk it. I think it was because he had seen so much ugliness in war. Emotional shrapnel had done far more damage than the pieces of metal he could point to buried in his arms. So much so that he forbade his 2 sons and his 5 grandsons from ever joining the military. And so I've found my own way to walk in his shoes. A small memorial of my own, reminding me of his life and his love, a connection of past and present. He taught me the power of remembrance in life, and so I aim to remember him in death. When we make a memorial of something, we name it as sacred. This past March, Reverend Strauss preached on the sanctity of life. Death, as the culmination of life, is thus the culmination of many sacred experiences. We don't just hold a funeral, we hold a memorial service. So when death comes unnaturally or unjustly, especially the deaths of many at once, we often feel compelled to make that memorial permanent. It becomes hallowed ground. Why can't we stop consecrating the ground in blood? How many memorials have we made this week alone? Far, far too many. This Memorial Day weekend, we're memorializing more than just the lives lost to war. We are remembering lives lost to gun violence, to COVID-19. We hope to memorialize the unspeakable loss our nation has suffered in recent years. It is a profound and precarious duty to speak for the dead. Our reading today seeks to show the pain that doing so poorly can cause. And to be clear, I did not set out to call anyone a hypocrite by selecting it. This is a cultural issue, and what we as a culture for so long now have been dealing with is our enmeshment in unjust systems, alongside those of racism, predatory capitalism, and their ilk. There is also militarism. Whether or not we actively perpetuate them, there is always some transference, some voice echoing in our head, and the amplification of those voices across 300 million minds has a power not easily quantified. But Reverend Yandel has given it a name: the log in the eye of society. This log has destroyed our depth perception and made society insist that we see it through these flattened, unquestioned narratives. But as with my grandfather, we don't always play the part we're assigned. That, I will remind you, is the meaning of the word hypocrite, an actor. One who repeats what they've been told to say as they've been told to say it. A mouthpiece with no critical thought. Grand narratives of war, violence, and inevitability would drown out our individual narratives instead of allowing the many stories to provide context and critique for the larger ones. Everyone here has their own unique story, shaped by experience and by conscience. Proud veterans and those who feel regret. Conscientious objectors and draft dodgers. Pacifists and believers in just war. There are those of you who don't know how to feel, and those who are constantly in a state of flux. It is okay to be conflicted. Honestly, I think it's better than being certain. Uncertainty allows us to be moved. It allows our memorials to do what they're meant to do. The dead can't speak for themselves. For those who left little behind, we risk a kind of desecration, the theft of their voices to add to the chorus of uncritical patriotism. Maybe instead of talking about what the dead died for, we should be asking what they died from. War, bigotry, ego, politics. These things kill people. And rarely did they sign up for it. Even those who willingly went to war, I'm certain, hoped to return. Our cultural narratives don't focus on the pain, the grief, or the fear of those final moments, the profound loneliness of death on a battlefield, or the existential dread of the unknown. And what of those scars which linger in the hearts and minds of survivors? Our crisis of unhoused veterans and their vastly higher suicide rate are proof enough of that. And soldiers, it must be said, aren't the only victims of war or even the most prevalent. Still more often ignored are the multitude of civilians lost and traumatized. They did not ask for death, and yet death came for them. just as it is now for our shoppers, our worshipers, and our school children. They didn't know they were going into war zones. After all, they lived in the greatest country in the world. These two need to be part of how we talk about our collective past and our collective present. These two must be memorialized. These two are sacred. Something sacred is something set apart. But we often conflate that with sacrosanct, that which is beyond criticism. So much of how we talk about the past, about war, and about death co-opts the language of sacredness, placing it beyond the reach of our examination. We do this because we're afraid to see the blood on our hands. We celebrate our collective identity while washing our hands of our collective responsibility. You can't have it both ways. Those grand patriotic narratives would tell you otherwise. The sacred is only meaningful when it is both set apart and imminent. Do you recall what God said to Moses on their first meeting? Take off your shoes, God says. This is holy ground. In other words, remove the barrier between you and I. The sacred is not meant to be unreachable. It is meant to move us out of what we perceive of as an unremarkable, unchanging reality and into something greater. Then we're meant to bring it back with us. That holy dust would cling to Moses' shoes for as long as he had them. He, too, wore on his feet a memorial of his encounter with the sacred. So when we talk about the past and about loss, are we making it sacred or are we making it sacrosanct? Is it making us feel something or are we keeping it at arm's length? We often ask ourselves, how can we do this correctly? And that, my friends, is the wrong question. Our problematic cultural narratives exist because of our obsession with perfection. Ethicist Sharon Welch has written extensively about our North American culture, and specifically the middle class. At the core of how so many of us operate, she says, is this ethic of control. It is defined by a complete and total avoidance of anything that shows our blind spots, our flaws, our fragility. Our ego is tied directly to our sense of competence, of having it all together. The perfect truly is the enemy of the good. This obsession prevents us from genuinely encountering each other. And to combat this, she urges that we adopt an ethic of risk, which sees us engaging in dialogue, mutual critique, and political action. In other words, we have to let ourselves be wounded in order to grow. I would remind you that though it has softened with time and use, the root of the word compassion means to suffer with. That is where we find the sacred, in asking where the pain in our history can be found and letting ourselves feel it. I asked already once how many memorials we've made this past week, and I will ask again. Do we even know? They have become so common that we lose count. We actually have to debate the definition of casualty and whether it's based on injuries or deaths. And regardless of how we answer that question, most of us don't know the number. How has this become an abstraction? And yet that is exactly what it has become, an abstraction answered with thoughts and prayers. Let me tell you right now that far too few of those prayers result in encounters with the sacred. They are hollow words, unchained from action, lip service paid to the Prince of Peace while burning sacrifices on the altar of the God of War. If anything is blasphemous, surely it is that. I have been sitting with this anger for days now. Maybe you feel it too. Maybe you feel more grief or guilt or fear. Maybe you feel all of them, wave upon wave. Maybe you're so burned out by trauma after trauma that you can't feel anything right now. Wherever you find yourself, be it standing, sitting, or lying prostrate in the dirt, shouting, "Why? Why?" I invite you to listen to these words from assassinated Salvadoran Archbishop and recently canonized saint, Oscar Romero. Peace is not the product of terror or fear. Peace is not the silence of cemeteries. Peace is not the silent result of violent repression. Peace is the generous, tranquil contribution of all to the good of all. Peace is dynamism. Peace is generosity. It is right, and it is duty. Today, we can sit with the silence of the grave and the pain of loss and injustice. But the sacred, those things we have made memorials of, call us to be transformed and to be transformers. They say, "This happened. We cannot change that. Let's not let it happen again." So once you have rested, and please take as long as you need, I invite you to stand up, put on your shoes, and come and join in the work. Amen.